Good afternoon. My name is Ted Walk. I'm the Outreach Division Chief for the Fish and Boat Commission. I welcome you here today. We're going to be starting off the ceremony here with the presentation of colors. This is by the Fish and Boat Commission Color Guard.
That's just a group that does it. That's a group that does it. Everybody, I think, has that uniform. It's a special occasion.
Let's all proceed with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, please take your seats. I hope many of you got a chance to see some of the photos that we were cycling through up here. We were fortunate enough to come across those in our archives. A number of the photos were actually presentations made to Mr. Abele at his retirement ceremony. So it was a great find to be able to obtain those photos. To start off the proceedings at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our Executive Director, the Fish and Boat Commission's Executive Director, John A. Arway.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. It is my pleasure and distinct honor to be able to welcome all of you here today for the dedication of the official state historical marker commemorating one of our Commonwealth's great conservation leaders. I would first like to thank the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and my fellow members of the Ralph Abele Conservation Scholarship Fund Board of Directors for making this event possible. I would also like to recognize members of the board who I would ask to stand when I call your name. Ed Burns, Cindy Dunn, Frank Feldbaum, Joe Green, Dennis Geis, Dave Hess, Wayne Kober, Gary Moore, and Ted Walk, and emeritus member Steve Walsh. I want to particularly thank Ted Walk and the other Fish and Boat Commission staff who coordinated today's event. I thank all of you for attending today's ceremony, especially the Abele family members who we will hear from later in the program, and the old guard, like former commissioners Sam Wallione and Walter Gibbs and Bob Martin, who are here today in attendance today. I'd also like to thank our 6 members of our Board of Commissioners for attending. I guess we have a quorum in case we have to take any official action, too. Ralph W. Abele was Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish Commission from 1972 through 1987. I was fortunate to begin my career as a semi-skilled laborer with the Commission in 1980 under his leadership. Mr. Abele was, as most of us called him because of reverence and rank, was a man of great vision and determination. He was an amazing leader and influenced the careers of many, including myself. I have a framed personal note on my office wall that he sent me in April 1988. It was after he retired and I had just been promoted to be chief of the Environmental Services Division. His words were motivation for me then and continue to motivate me today. Quote, "I'm delighted you're the chief. You have the background and the guts that are needed." He would often include personal messages on internal correspondence to many of us, such as, "You are our hope for the future." He was an amazing man who accomplished amazing things. Dr. Maurice Goddard was recognized by our agency in 1992 for his lifetime of service to the conservation of the environment in Pennsylvania and our nation. In his acceptance speech to the Ralph Abele Conservation Heritage Award, he said that, quote, "With Ralph's leadership, the Fish Commission was the environmental conscience for the environment in Pennsylvania." We all know that Mr. Abele heard those words since he told us at his retirement dinner that he would be hovering above the clouds and would swoop down whenever he was needed to give us a hand. He was an inspiration to many of us in many different but similar ways. Although he despised political interference in agency operations, he knew how to get the politics to work for us and not against us. He always seemed to be on the right side of the issues, whether it was Dock Street Dam and smallmouth bass or boaters, or Hell Run, where we fought back coal miners for brook trout. Well, most of you know that I can go on for hours with war stories of the past, but I want to leave you with one more story. Shortly after I was appointed executive director, I had the occasion to travel to New England and cross paths with Ralph Abele Jr. We had planned to kayak his home river, but the weather spoiled that adventure, but we did some catching up at the social hour at the conference we were attending. Ralph Jr. caught me completely by surprise when he presented me with his dad's gold Waterways Patrolman badge. I promised Ralph Jr. that I always carry it in my badge wallet right beside my Waterways Conservation Officer badge. My father once told me a story about why he had that metal-jacketed Bible that he was issued in World War II. And I'm confident now that I have 2 badges in my left breast pocket, I'm virtually invincible. Now that I'm director of the same agency that Mr. Abele was so proud to serve, I am personally motivated to strive to meet the standards he set for us, and I'm grateful to be able to join you today to memorialize his legacy. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker will be Franklin Curry. He's a past senator, PA senator, and state representative. Mr. Curry?
Okay. Well, thank you, Ted and John, and ladies and gentlemen, and the Abele family. I am really happy to be here today. I know the Commission's been looking forward to this for some time, and so have I. I am honored to be able to give the keynote speech today, because I knew Ralph, I worked with him, and I'll tell you some of the good things that need to be told here today. But before I do that, I have to say that I appreciate speaking in front of this particular flag. And the reason is, 20 years ago, I gave that same flag to my wife for her birthday. And I wanted to tell you, as a husband, I never made a better gift. I think this is a great day today for the Abele family, for the waterways of Pennsylvania, the environment of Pennsylvania, for the Fish Commission, and all of us who knew Ralph and worked with Ralph. So what I'd like to do is tell you 2 stories about Ralph. The first is my favorite personal story, and then I want to tell you the story of Ralph's impact on the environment of Pennsylvania. First, the personal story. Shortly after I left the Senate, I think it was 1982 or 83, I took one of my sons shad fishing on the Delaware. And I had a 14-foot boat that we trailed behind the car. We got over there and we were shad fishing. And we were about 20 yards from the New Jersey shore when he anchored. Nothing happened, so we thought we'd pull up the anchor and go to a different spot. I couldn't get the anchor free. What the heck do I do? I could cut it, but then we couldn't anchor anyplace else. So I was looking all around, and suddenly across the river towards the Pennsylvania side, I saw a fish commission boat, a green boat with a stripe down the side, and I waved at it. And it came towards me. And as I got closer, there was a guy standing up on the right side with a steel pot, and a flak jacket. So I said to my son, that's either George C. Scott or General Patton on a waterborne Jeep. Well, of course, 60 seconds later, it was Ralph Abele. He came up to my boat. He looked at me very seriously. He pulled out a knife, a big hunting knife, and handed it to me, started to hand it to me, handle first, and said, here, cut yourself free. What's going on here? And he pulled it back and he laughed. And then 2 minutes later, he had my anchor freed, and we were able to go on. But the best thing happened 2 or 3 weeks later. I got a package in the mail from Ralph, about that big. And when I opened it, it was a large plastic replica of a shad, like the kind you see out here. And I have had that shad on my wall in my den ever since, and I'll have it there forever. But Ralph had that mischievous sense of humor of seeing me in a tough spot and making me sweat a little. But the second story I want to tell is the story, the far more important, is the story of Ralph's impact on the environment of Pennsylvania. Because Ralph was a unique environmental leader in developing Pennsylvania's environmental future. To appreciate Ralph's role, though, I want to take just a moment to look at the environmental history of Pennsylvania. Because without that, you don't really appreciate the impact of what happened. In the century after the Civil War, Pennsylvania's government was dominated by the coal industry, the steel industry, and the railroad industry. And they brazenly exploited our natural resources. Take the coal industry, for example. In 1905, the Shamokin and Pottsville Railroad Company gave a deed to Monroe Culp in Northumberland County for 95 acres. The borough of Culpmont is now built there. But in the deed, the coal company, the railroad company specifically reserved to itself the right to discharge into the waters of Shamokin Creek the waste of its coal mines forever. That gives you some idea of the arrogance of the coal companies. That same year, 1905, the state passed its first clean streams law in response to disease caused by untreated sewage going into the waterways. The coal industry was completely exempted. In 1923, 1937, and 1945, there were other clean streams laws passed. And every single one of them had an exemption for the coal industry or very favorable treatment. In 1965, 100 years after the Civil War, the legislature finally brought the coal companies under the Clean Streams Law with the Act, with Law 585. But by that time, the damage had been done. Pennsylvania went into the second third of the 20th century with more miles of acid mine drainage polluted streams, more acres of acid or mine drainage, mine scars, strip line, abandoned land than any state in the country. The coal companies had taken the wealth from our land, transferred it elsewhere, and left it for us to clean up the mess. And Pennsylvania government wasn't really able or organized to do that job. We had the Department of Forests and Waters. You had the Department of Health, the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries. You had the Fish Commission. You had the Sanitary Water Board. You had others. Everyone had a piece of the environment, but there was no central commission, no central mission, no coordination. And so that's how we start at the last third of the 20th century. But in that year, 1966, we began in Pennsylvania a revolution to undo that damage and build a new future. I was elected to the House in 1966 on a pledge of a new Clean Streams law. Because of that, I had the honor of winding up in the very middle, the very center of the legislative efforts to undo the damage and pass new legislation for a new environmental future. John Laudadio was chairman of our committee. I became the secretary, and we passed a tremendous amount of legislation, which I'll get to in just a minute. But we recognized that we could not do this without staff help. You know how bad it was? When I came to the House, I didn't have an office. I didn't have a secretary. I didn't have a telephone. And the only thing I had was my seat on the floor of the House. So we knew we had to have backup and support. And this is where Ralph Abele came to Harrisburg. In 1967, the legislature had enacted the Joint House-Senate Water and Air Pollution Control Committee for the purpose of providing the staff work and the backup, the research, the investigation we needed to deal with the kind of legislation that we were going to be passing. So at that point, in 1969, the legislature chose Ralph Abele to be the executive director of that committee. And it was a great choice. He was the right choice. Ralph filled the role with distinction. He brought to the position an exemplary fervor, enthusiasm, dedication, and a knowledge that made a truly significant contribution to the legislation that we passed between 1969 and 1972. Consider the following: a comprehensive Clean Streams Law, an All-Surface Mining Act, the Solid Waste Management Act, the Pennsylvania Scenic Rivers Act, the Department of Environmental Resources Act, the act requiring PennDOT to conduct environmental studies and planning highway projects, and of course, the environmental amendment to the state constitution, Article 1, Section 27. Taken together, these and other bills, other laws, provided the legal and constitutional framework we needed for a new environment here in Pennsylvania. But to make that happen, people had to make it happen. And that's when Ralph went to the Fish Commission in 1972 as its executive director. He did the same thing here at the Fish Commission he did for the Legislative Committee. He gave it a clear environmental mission, leadership, enthusiasm, and a relentless determination to eliminate water pollution. Ralph enthusiastically used broadened powers of the Fish Commission, along with the DER, to enforce the Clean Streams Law. He pursued violators vigorously. The DER had boots on the ground, but Ralph had boats in the water. And he used them to make the Fish Commission a formidable guardian of the waterways of Pennsylvania. Ralph also became one of the most zealous and dedicated champions of the environmental amendment to the state constitution. He believed it. He loved it. He did everything he could to advocate the principles of that amendment, that the people of Pennsylvania have a right to a clean environment, and that the state of Pennsylvania should serve as trustee for these natural resources for future generations. So Ralph promulgated that everywhere, on the Fish Commission magazine, in offices all around the state, and wherever he went. Ralph also picked up the banner of restoring shad to the Susquehanna. As a House member, I had tried to force the power companies to install fish ladders in the 4 dams. But my effort was stymied by the fact that the Conowingo, which is the first dam, is in the state of Maryland. And therefore, the Pennsylvania legislature can't do anything about it. We have no jurisdiction. But Ralph found a way to get around that hurdle. He led an effort to get the Federal Power Commission to require the installation of fish ladders as a condition for renewal of their federal licenses. And as a result of these efforts, fish passage devices are now in the Conowingo and the other dams. At the Joint Legislative Committee and the Fish Commission, Ralph demonstrated another trait of effective leadership. He employed and mentored good people to help him. Ralph knew that in politics or government, you don't get anything accomplished alone or by yourself. You need a team. It's not golf, it's not tennis, it's football. And Ralph, therefore, hired and mentored such talented environmentalists as John Schellenberger, Pete Duncan, Larry Schweiger, and our own John Arway. That was the kind of team he put in the field to fight for the environmental cause. Governor Casey had a question he'd like to ask everybody who he met who had served in public office, appointed or elected. And the question is this: what did you do with the power of your office when you had it? Ralph Abele could answer that question very proudly. Look at the record. A great deal and a great deal more. Let us therefore dedicate the marker that's outside the building to the memory of Ralph Abele. His spirit, his commitment to the waterways of Pennsylvania and the environment of Pennsylvania are here forever, for all time. He will always be a hero of the environmental revolution. He gave it leadership when it counted in building a new environmental future for the great state of Pennsylvania. Ralph, thank you, and God bless you.
Okay, I'd like to now introduce Larry Schweiger. He's the president and CEO of National Wildlife Federation. Mr. Schweiger.
This is a very special day for me. I spent most of my life listening to and learning from Ralph Abele. I met Ralph when I was just 14 years old, and he showed up to actually teach us how to identify trees and shrubs and wild plants. And it was an interesting moment because we were expecting Roger Latham, but Roger Latham was called away for another matter, and so Ralph showed up, and we didn't know who this guy was, and he looked at me, and the first thing he did was chew me out because I was wearing sneakers to go on a hike into the woods, and he told me quite in a military way that I was off base with my shoes and I needed to get myself together. And that started an incredible friendship that we had. You know, Ralph was my Scout leader, and he was many other young men's Scout leader. And he was a great, great Scout leader. You know, he won the Silver Beaver Award. He just absolutely loved what the Scouts stood for. Later was instrumental in bringing the Scouts to their Eastern Jamboree at Moraine State Park, a very important moment in Ralph's life. But before he was my Scout leader, Ralph was a great military leader, and if you look at his military record, it's second to none. And Ralph used to often give Winston Churchill speeches in Winston Churchill ways, and it was quite remarkable, telling us a story of what was taking place during the war, and then giving the wartime speeches of Winston Churchill. It was very moving, and I still hear those speeches today. When I applied for the Joint House Senate Conservation Committee, and Senator Curry, it's so great to see you. What a great leader you've been, and it's great to see you once again. But when I applied for the position of the Joint Conservation Committee, Pete Duncan was interviewing me, and he went through a whole process, and I met with a number of the members of the committee, and Pete finally said, well, there's one other person I'd like you to meet. And he said that before I make a decision, so would you jump in my car? So we drove out to Walnut Street, and all of a sudden I realized we were headed to the Fish Commission to see Ralph Abele. And so I didn't get a chance to explain to Pete that Ralph was my Scout leader. So we walk into Ralph's office, and Senator Curry was right about his mischievous humor. He looked at me, and Pete said, Ralph, I want to introduce you to Larry Schwager. He's a finalist for this position. And Ralph just looked at Pete and said, Pete, surely you can do better than that. And poor Pete blanched. His whole face went white, and he was so embarrassed for what Ralph had just done. And of course, I was sitting there laughing because I had known how Ralph's great humor was. After I got hired by the committee, by Pete and the others, the committee, Ralph took me out to lunch, and we went down to the Locust Street Cafe. You may remember that on 2nd Street, and he took me down to lunch, and he said, Larry, I want you to know something. He said, there are 2 times when you can really have an impact in government. He said, the first time is when you're young and you don't give a shit. He said, the second time is when you're old and you don't give a shit. He said, you're in that first category and I'm in the second category, so let's go have fun. And that was Ralph. There was a moment in my life when I really needed some support, and Ralph and his dear wife Peggy invited me to their house for dinner and spend a weekend with them. And we were talking about my life circumstance, and he was really coaching me and helping me to sort through some things. And while we were sitting there in his living room talking, the telephone rang, and he picked up the phone, and it was George Bloom, who was George was the chairman of the Republican Committee and chairman of the State Utility Commission. And Bloom had this real booming voice, and I could hear him from across the room. He goes, "Hi, Ralph, how are you doing? This is George." And Ralph goes, "Hi, George, how are you this evening?" And George says, "Not so good, Ralph." And Ralph said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, a couple of your waterways patrolmen arrested one of my good friends." And Ralph paused for a moment, and he says, "George, you need to pick your friends more carefully." And that was the end of that conversation. And that's the way Ralph was. And his field force understood that, because Ralph said it was resources first. And he believed that, and he inculcated that notion into the great team. He used to call them the thin green line. And that's a great tradition to this day. Ralph also was a great leader on acid rain, and we worked the halls of Congress, working particularly close with the late Senator John Hines, who dearly loved Ralph because Ralph was a great person and a great military leader, and Hines just loved everything about Ralph. And so anyway, we convinced Senator Hines that he needed to be the sponsor on the acid rain control bill. And after much work in the state, we got the momentum going to get this done. And so Senator Hines and Senator Tim Wirth from Colorado wrote the acid rain control bill of 1990. And we got it passed, and it was the first cap and trade pollution control bill in the history of the planet. And Senator Tim Wirth went on beyond that and wrote it into the Kyoto Agreement, the same basic principle that we put into the original acid rain program we put in for carbon dioxide. So that notion that Ralph believed so strongly in, doing it right and doing it in a reasonable way. Continues to this day. I find it really interesting that the Canadians honored all the folks who were instrumental in passing the acid rain control bill, which incidentally just recently led to the elimination of mercury from power plants. We finally got the rules enacted. After 1990, we finally got the rules passed, and the industry wants more time to consider, give me a break. But anyway, we were able to do that, and it's a great example of Ralph's leadership and his tenacity. But the Canadians, when they put together the list of people that they wanted to honor, Ralph's name is on that list first. It's because his name's starting with A, but it was also about his willingness to make it happen. And I've talked often to the leaders of that movement, and they believed very strongly that Ralph was critical to that effort. During the years of James Watt as Secretary of Interior, Ralph had a lot of problems with Secretary Watt, as you can imagine, and so did I and others. And so we wrote a letter to Senator Hines asking that Senator Hines urge the president to fire James Watt because he was doing all these bad things. And so Senator Hines called us up and he said, "Have you ever actually met with this guy?" And we said, "No, we haven't." So he said, "Let me set something up." So we went on to have breakfast with Secretary Watt in the Secretary of Interior's office, and the meeting started off, and Senator Hines introduced everybody around the room, and he started with Doc Goddard, who spoke and raised a number of his concerns about what the Secretary was doing wrong, and then he got to Ralph Abele, and Ralph really laid into him on a number of things, on the surface mining program, and on it goes, and Watt sat there for a minute, and he finally said, "You're nothing but a bunch of liberal pinko communists." Can you imagine that? And I looked over at Senator Hines, and his face got beet red. He stood up, and he looked at Secretary Watt, and he said, "This meeting is over." And he walked out of the building with us. We didn't even have breakfast yet. We just were drinking coffee. And we walked out of the Secretary of Interior's office, and he got out on the street, and he said, "I'm going to communicate to Ronald Reagan that this man needs to go." And in fact, he did. The thing about Ralph that a lot of people don't know is that Ralph was actually mentored as a boy by John M. Phillips. And some of you may know that name, but John Phillips founded the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He was instrumental in the acquisition of the first game lands. He wrote the game code. He was an incredible conservationist of a generation before Ralph. And so Ralph was really inculcated with that. But John Phillips actually was taught by a Native American Indian chief from the Chippewa tribe, actually, whose name was Chief Big Storm. And so Ralph had this multi-generational dimension to him because he understood the tradition of John Phillips, the tradition of Big Storm. And he understood that we have a duty to take care of nature and that we needed to love nature, and Ralph did so deeply. And in thinking about that, one of the things that we used to tease Ralph about a lot was his stubbornness. When Ralph made his mind up, you couldn't change it. It was pretty straightforward. It didn't matter who was against him. It didn't matter what issue it might be, including rattlesnakes. I mean, Ralph would go to the mat for a rattlesnake. I see this snake out here, and it's a cute story that's with that. But Ralph believed very strongly that stubbornness was not a vice, but a virtue. And he used to tell me that. He said, it's not a vice, it's a virtue. You just need to be careful about the things that you're stubborn, because you just might make those happen. And that sticks with me. And to this day, when I'm facing a tough decision, whether it's on climate change, and incidentally, I know for certain where Ralph would be on climate change. There's no doubt in my mind what he'd be doing today. And so when I work on issues like that, I remember what Ralph would say, and I hear his voice. I hear his gravelly voice today. And it means a lot to me. The snake that we see in front of us is another sweet story, and I'll close with that because it really sums up who Ralph was. Ralph used to wear a tie when he met with the governor once a year. The governor had this required meeting with the commission heads, and Ralph used to wear this "Don't Tread on Me" tie. And Dick Thornburg 7 years in a row saw the same tie. And he used to say, "Ralph, don't you have another tie to wear?" And so the final year that Thornburg was in office, Ralph showed up and he had a tartan tie on. And the governor saw this tie. He said, "Ralph, I'm sure glad your wife got you a new tie." And Ralph said, "Well, Governor, this is tartan, and the meaning behind this is don't tread on me." So it's with great fondness that I reflect on this man who had a profound influence on not just me, but on thousands of Scouts and others through his many years of service. And certainly the impact on this agency has been tremendous. Ralph was so proud of the Fish Commission, so proud of the courageous waterways patrolmen and all the other staff that worked so hard to make this place a special place. And I worry deeply what I'm seeing on the Susquehanna River and on the Juniata and declines of these fisheries. It just breaks my heart. And I know damn well that Ralph Abele will be fighting hard to stop climate change, because it's warm water and it's also pollution. And those are the things that Ralph knew were absolutely critical for fisheries. So working together, we can carry on that great tradition that Ralph has started. And I'm so glad to see all the folks who are in this room today willing to come out to celebrate a great human being. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schweiger. Today's ceremony is being presented by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, and the Ralph W. Abele Conservation Scholarship Fund. And representing the fund today is Dennis Geis. He's formerly Deputy Executive Director of the Fish and Boat Commission. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Ted. I'm honored to be able to say a few words today about Ralph Abele's legacy and the Ralph W. Abele Scholarship Fund. I want to thank Executive Director Arway and the commissioners and Ted Walk for putting together this ceremony and for making the decision to bring us inside. A very wise decision. I met Ralph Abele in the summer of 1978. I was a captain in the Air Force at JAG. I came here to the Fish Commission for an interview with him. He sat behind his "Don't Tread on Me" flag. He smoked a cigarette, because back then that's what people did in offices, and he had ashtrays all over. He asked me some questions, and little did I know then that Ralph would become not just my client in the legal sense, but a mentor and an inspiration for me throughout my life. We worked on the new Fish and Boat Code and other legislation. We intervened in the dam relicensing cases before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, as Frank Curry mentioned. And Ralph testified about the importance of American shad, as did, I think, John and Bob Hesser and several other people from our state. And our testimony made a difference, and Ralph's testimony made a difference. We attended many future task force meetings and talked about laws and policies to protect, conserve, and enhance the resource, not just for now, but for the future. Ralph Abele, Ken Sink, Maurice Doc Goddard, Pete Duncan, Larry Schweiger, Lenny Green, and many others, they called themselves the Old Bastards. And they would gather at camp once or twice a year to talk about conservation. Their focus was not on the problems of the present or the immediate issues. Their focus was on the future, the big issues beyond the horizon. Clean water, clean air, sustainable resources, paradigm shifts, and policy changes is what they talked about. The Old Bastards, or at least the oldest of them, grew up during the Depression, fought in World War II. It would not be too much of an exaggeration to call them the greatest generation of conservation leaders in Pennsylvania. They helped write the Environmental Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and they worked hard to get it passed by the voters. That was the significant step. It had to not just be passed by 2 sessions of the legislature, it had to be passed by the voters. And it was passed overwhelmingly because of the work of people like Ralph Abele and many others, including Frank Curry. They changed laws and major policies, always guided by a commitment to conservation, a love of the outdoors, a love of fishing and hunting, and a philosophy that would come to be defined in just 2 words: resource first. We've come today to dedicate a marker in honor of Ralph W. Abele, and it's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we need to pursue the great task that Ralph and his friends and the Old Bastards undertook in the 1970s and 1980s. We too need to look to the future, and especially step back from the issues and problems of today and think about our conservation future beyond the horizon. When Ralph died in 1990, his co-workers and friends in the Fish Commission and in the broader conservation community looked at how best to preserve his legacy. The Commission created the Ralph W. Abele Conservation Heritage Award, and the list of recipients of that award reads like the honor roll of conservation in Pennsylvania. Some of the Abele Award winners were Old Bastards themselves, but others were those who pursued different paths to conservation excellence. Like all awards, the Conservation Heritage Award looked backwards at accomplishments and lifetime achievements. The Commission also created the Ralph W. Abele Memorial Glen at Station 22. And some of you, I know many of you, have been there and seen it. We were there when you dedicated it and when we dedicated the monument to Lenny Green at the same place. It's a place there by Penns Creek where an angler or a visitor can stop and reflect on Ralph's legacy while enjoying the beauty of Penns Woods and fishing in the waters of Penns Waters, or Penns Creek, as we should call it. A group of us also created the Ralph W. Abele Conservation Scholarship Fund. The early board of directors included Peggy Abele, Lenny Green, Doc Goddard, Cheryl Riley, Pete Duncan, Joe Green, Steve Walsh, Norm Shea of the Greenwood Area School District, and myself. In addition to his abiding commitment to conservation, Ralph was an educator. He was a member of the Greenwood School District up in Millerstown, and he believed strongly in investing in the education of our youth was the way to build the future. What better way to honor Ralph's legacy and try to inspire new generations than to build a scholarship program? Since its inception, the Ralph W. Abele Conservation Scholarship Fund has been incorporated and got IRS 501c3 status as a charitable organization. We raised money through sale of the Straight Talk books, which are all sold out now, and through the Abele mugs, which are also all sold out, and through these pins. These pins reflect the Gadsden flag. This was long before the Tea Party adopted the Gadsden flag, but it was. It says Ralph W. Abele Conservation Scholarship Fund, and don't tread on me in the rattlesnake, which played an important part in the revolution. The scholarship fund has awarded more than 35 scholarships worth more than $30,000. We award these scholarships to support the post-secondary education of young people in environmental disciplines such as fisheries, ecology, forestry, wildlife management, environmental engineering, environmental enforcement, and environmental resource management. We know the amount that we can give and have given in scholarships is relatively small compared to the cost of education today, but our goal is simple, that through this small boost that we can give a young person, we can help a deserving young man or woman succeed and reach their goals, and that their accomplishments will keep Ralph's legacy alive for years to come. The scholarship fund is focused on the future, the way the Old Bastards were in their conversations. They talked about the long-term future beyond the horizon, and we're investing beyond the horizon. Our great hope is that one of the recipients of the Ralph W. Abele Conservation Scholarship will someday become a conservation giant in Pennsylvania. We all hope so. The scholarship fund also supports efforts to maintain and preserve the legacy of Ralph Abele through projects such as the Legacy Project, which is currently ongoing, and in supporting the acquisition of this historic marker here at the Fish and Boat Commission. I believe we were limited to just 70 words on the marker by the Historical Museum Commission, and it was really tough for all of us who worked on that to try to come up with 70 words to describe Ralph Abele's legacy and Ralph Abele's contributions to this agency and to this Commonwealth. But when you think about Ralph, as so many of us are doing today, you can really grab a fair summary of his accomplishments and his legacy with just 5 words, or 6 words. And those words are protect, conserve, enhance, and resource first. That is Ralph Abele's legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. I had mentioned the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. This is actually the marker program, is their program, so we're very honored today to have one of its commissioners here, Mr. Frederick Powell.
Abele family members, honored guests, and all of you who are here to celebrate this worthwhile cause, I bring you greetings from the governor. Now that's my official responsibilities. I can't tell you how much I enjoy these events, and I was amazed by the crossover and the kinship I felt as I read the information. The information is about 3/4 of an inch thick that the commission receives about the historical event or the person that we're honoring. And as I read that, those of you who know Ralph Abele's life know that he was born on a farm near Pittsburgh, was a Boy Scout and a leader, was a company commander in the 3rd Armored Division, and among many other things was affiliated with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. As I read about Mr. Abele, the feeling of being akin to his life was extraordinary. Because I was born to a farm family north of Pittsburgh, spent 7 years in scouting, plus serving as a scout leader, with 5 years on active duty as a regular Army officer, there was an immediate connection. But even more unique, I was a company commander in the 3rd Armored Division. We spent years together, Ralph and I. That's, of course, 20 years apart. I've written articles and papers and have been an ecologist by avocation and written articles on ecology and conservation. And currently I'm a member of many conservation organizations, not the least of which is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So I thought, here I am substituting for someone else who was supposed to be here, and I thought, I'm the one who's supposed to be here speaking about this man, and I thank you for the opportunity. As I hope you appreciate, these historical markers, as the one we dedicate today, are a very important part of educating us all about our history. They are usually at the location where the history took place, and that gives us a context. It's better than books, it's better than photos, it's where it happened. And of our 2,000 markers, they are so important that I'm going to read you the locations now. I really enjoy stopping and reading the markers. It's more than a history lesson. It truly is being there, and as you look, as I said, you're in the context. Whether there are rolling hills and there was a battle there, or whether there was something else that happened, you can look around you and see the context. Our state has done a great job of commemorating lives, such as Ralph Abele's, as well as key historic sites. When you take the time to read our historic markers in Pennsylvania, I am so sure that you and the people with you are going to say, wow, I didn't know that. It happens every time. Every time I've stopped, my family sometimes think I stop too often. But they say, wow, I didn't know that. And now I want to thank all of you who are diligent in researching and going through the process to commemorate Mr. Abele's accomplishments. The process is not easy, and PHMC at times receives applications and requests which don't measure up or aren't sufficiently documented to stand up to historic scrutiny. Thank you on behalf of my fellow commissioners and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission for adding an important educational piece to our Pennsylvania heritage. Thank you very much.
Hi again. I have the distinct opportunity and privilege to introduce a family member of Ralph. It happens to be Ralph Jr., his son, who's a friend and colleague of mine over the years. And Ralph chose to take his passion and determination north and fight for in-stream flow issues in New England. And we welcome him and his wife and Ralph's grandson here today, Jeremy, who are going to join us and tell us a little bit about some of the family history. And I would ask you to join me in greeting Ralph Jr. to the podium. Dennis Geis also mentioned that the Straight Talk, bound Straight Talk editions of Ralph's columns are out of print, but we have 3 left, Ralph. And what I'd like to do is present them to the family for your archives.
Thank you. Great.
And leave those 2 there. They're the only thing they're holding up.
I don't have big pockets. So I guess there's an old Mark Twain adage that be careful about telling fish stories, especially where the people know the fish. And I'm not going to try to outlive any of the stories here, but they're, I guess the first thing I wanted to say is just a huge thank you to the Historic Commission, the Fish and Boat Commission, and the Scholarship Fund for putting this together. I mean, it's hard to describe what it's like to sit here and watch your dad's pictures go by. And a lot of what he did, I wasn't here. I was up in New England trying to cause trouble on my own up there. And I hear stories, and it's really, I think, special to have my son here, who was about 7 or 8 when Dad passed on, and he's heard me go on and on and on. But when you have a second or third person say that, it really means a lot. So from the family point of view, I really appreciate that. And I've been lucky enough to work in this business for a long time, a little bit more behind the scenes than my father, but he always counseled me to, unless you were head of an independent agency, to be careful which swords you fell on. And I've been trying to dodge those swords for a long time, but the spirit is still there, and it's hard to get by the genes. But I guess what is really special about this marker for me is that it keeps the message of resource protection alive. And on June 1st, we had our first granddaughter, who would be Ralph's first great-granddaughter. And I was along the Susquehanna today, not the Susquehanna, the Schuylkill, watching my son sit in a boat and go backwards, which as a kayaker, he and I have had issues about that for years, but he tells me it's a faster way to go to row than paddle. But every time I go down to watch him do that, I look across the river and I see the dam at Fairmont Park, and I think of the old picture that Dad sent me of Milton Shapp, the governor at the time. This was on the sign on the dam, and then it had a guy named Ralph Abele, executive director, and in a smaller font was somebody named Frank Rizzo. And I guess Mayor Rizzo, didn't want the dam built, but once he got over that, or maybe was told to do that, he wanted to know who the hell this Abele was, whose name was ahead of his. And if you read further down the sign, you'd realize it was put together by the Fish Commission, so it made a lot of sense that Dad's name was up there higher. But I guess I'll tell one story and stuff, and that is that growing up, we didn't have a lot of fancy vacations, and Dad's idea of fun was to load us all into the station wagon and drive up to Potter County to the New Bethlehem Rod and Gun Club, which is on beautiful land. And when you're 8 to 14, whatever I was in those years, you left all your friends behind, and I'd mow a little baseball diamond in the front yard and play baseball by myself. But we had lots of great nature hikes and so on and so forth. But he loved it, and that's what we did. But one day we were driving up, and we got behind a motorcycle gang, and they were drinking beer, and they're flipping the beer cans, out on the highway when they're done drinking. And Dad revs the car up, and he kind of pulls up in front of them, and I'm thinking, it's the last I'm ever going to see of my father. He didn't eat as many groceries as I did, and my son, he's not a huge person, but he went up there and gave those guys a lecture. And he came back and obviously lived beyond that. And I said, wow, that guy's got some guts. And this was before he went to work, full time. But he just really believed in simple things like, no littering and stuff like that. But I don't want to take up a lot of time here today, just to say that I'm the family, on behalf of the family and his 3 grandsons who aren't here, and his daughter, and my late mother, who I think actually enabled Dad to get away with a lot of stuff that he did. She really kept the fort together. He did learn to cook after he retired, but she really held things together, looked after the kids, and enabled him to do a lot of the stuff that he really, really believed in. But I'm just tickled, and to know that my young granddaughter will be able to come up here and take a look at this, and hopefully many other people through the Abele legacy that Dennis and Wayne and others are doing. I mean, I'm speechless, and I thank you all, and on behalf of the family, thanks.
to now introduce Cindy Dunn, Deputy Secretary for the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources.
Thanks, Ted. It's an honor to be asked to come up here on behalf of Susan Q. Stranahan, who wrote the book Susquehanna River of Dreams. We weren't going to read this given the proposed temperature outside, and we figured people would be swooning in the pavement by now, but since we're inside, we decided to read Susan's letter as part of the ceremony, and I'm very honored and touched to be in this lineup of speakers. I found myself dabbing tears and laughing and everything else. And listening to Dennis's words, I do think we need to renew the Old Bastard Society. And I don't know what we're going to do about their correct name for adding women to it. The B word, probably not appropriate, but we'll figure something out, and I think we should start today. But I was asked to read the letter on the scholarship committee. I'm the only blonde woman canoeist like Susan Stranahan, so I'll do my best and read her letter. For those who may not know Susan, she was the conservation and environmental writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer for years. And she just wrote clear articles and very well developed on the environment. And in that capacity, she covered the 3 Mile Island incident and won a Pulitzer Prize for her comprehensive coverage of TMI. So that inspired her to write a book, Susquehanna River of Dreams. And it's on that basis that she began to really get to know Ralph. So Susan writes, "Years ago, when I began work on my book, Susquehanna River of Dreams, the first person I sought out was Ralph Abele. As I wrote in the foreword, Ralph reassured me that I was embarking on a worthy mission. Little did I know. The Susquehanna is a natural resource that has always inspired dreamers. Unfortunately, some of their dreams nearly destroyed the river. Some of the dreams sacrificed public good for extraordinary private gain, and some of those dreams left behind environmental damage that will take generations to repair. Ralph was a dreamer too, a dreamer on a large scale, not just for the Susquehanna watershed, but for all of Pennsylvania, for its citizens today, and those yet to be born. His dreams not only envisioned our individual responsibilities toward conservation, but they also incorporate the vital role of government. That belief is perhaps best summarized by the eloquent language contained in Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution, which he helped Franklin Curry write. And we could probably do this like a responsive reading in church here. But I will read it, and anyone who cares to join me may feel free to do so. The people have the right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustees of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people." And that gives me goosebumps today, and I can't tell you how many times I've read it. Susan writes, "Over the many years that I lived in Pennsylvania and wrote about the environment, I kept that language posted beside my desk. It was a constant reminder that government and individuals alike share an obligation to ensure that we don't slip back to the days when all the dreams for Pennsylvania benefited only a few and not all of us. Today, as in the past, Pennsylvania is under enormous pressure to bargain away its natural assets for short-term economic gain, to sacrifice the progress we've made for easy solutions. We've seen the consequences of such trade-offs far too many times to fall victim to them again. I now live in Maine and regret very much not being able to attend today's ceremony to honor the legacy of Ralph Abele. This marker seems very fitting, and I hope all who see it are reminded of his role in making Pennsylvania such a lovely place. I'd argue that Ralph's legacy lives on in an even more appropriate place than this spot. It lives among all of us whose lives he touched and whose visions he inspired. And I suspect, were he here now, he'd look around and say to this crowd, 'What are you waiting for? There's work to do.'" Susan Q. Stranahan, July 1, Chebec Island, Maine. Thank you.
Okay, this is the moment we've been waiting for, the unveiling of the marker. I'd like to invite Commissioner Powell up here to this microphone here.
I'm going to read this. We had talked about perhaps reading it together, but you can look in your program and let me read it on behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. Ralph W. Abele, 1921 through 1990, conservation leader and Pennsylvania Fish Commission Executive Director, 1972 through 1987. Abele's resource-first philosophy strengthened the agency's mission to protect, conserve, and enhance water quality, improve fish passage, and increase youth conservation education. Notable achievements included modernizing the Fish and Boat Code, emphasizing conservation enforcement, and leading efforts to restore American shad to the Susquehanna River. If you will join with the Fish and Boat Commission, the Scholarship Fund, and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to dedicate this marker in his honor and to his memory, please respond with a resounding yes. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. As it was mentioned, because of the weather outside and such, we brought everything indoors here. We kind of monitored the situation with the weather forecast. It would have been nice to be out by the marker, but essentially this is the next best thing. I invite you, as you're exiting today, just immediately to the left as you exit the front doors, you'll see the actual marker unveiled. Most of you may have seen it, and coming in it was covered as we had shown here, so it would be an opportunity to kind of take it all in, see the actual marker. In addition to that, we also have some chilled water out here. It's a hot day. We invite you to grab a bottle of water as well upon leaving. I want to thank everyone for turning out today. And on behalf of the Fish and Boat Commission, Historical Museum Commission, and the Abele Scholarship Fund, thank you.